We are pleased to be joined today by Benay Shannon, co-founder, co-owner, and master distiller at Restless Spirits. So please join me in welcoming Benay Shannon to the stage.
I'll trade you. Thank you. There will be samples afterward also, so don't worry. You can try it again if you need to. So as Christina said, my name is Benay Shannon. I am the distiller at Restless Spirits Distilling. I actually have two other distillers that I've trained and that do most of the heavy lifting now. So I'm kind of laying back and doing this kind of stuff now. So this is great. Before I became a distiller, I was actually a science teacher at Park Hill South High School. I taught freshmen. People say, what did you teach? Well, I taught freshmen, which is a subject all itself. Basically, there's a smattering of everything, physics, chemistry, biology. So, and my background is pretty much in science. I started distilling when my husband decided that we needed to start a business. And he thought a distillery would be cool because he's got branding experience and you could make great brands for distilled products. It's pretty awesome. And craft distilling was up and coming at the time. There were just a few, but it was becoming a thing. And so we were all about it. Except that branding only sells the first time. And if you want repeat sales, you have to have something in the bottle that is worth having. And so he looks at me one day and he says, hey, you know science. You could figure this out. I thought, sure, I'll do that. So it's been lab day every day for me since then. It's pretty awesome. I just want to let you know that I will answer questions at the end, but if you have questions as I go, I'm totally good with that too. Feel free to interrupt. If we start going down a rabbit hole, I'll try to reel us back in. My experience as a teacher, I get familiar with going down rabbit holes because sometimes they like to get off topic, but I think we'll do a pretty good job staying on. But please ask anything you want. First thing we're going to start out with is talking a little bit about spirits in general. How do you know what it is that you're making? Well, it's all governed by the federal government. They have an organization called the TTB, Tax and Trade Bureau, has responsibility for alcohol. Now, this is actually a recent change. Originally, all the alcohol was controlled by the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And it was a control mechanism by the government. But when after 9/11 and they created the Department of Homeland Security, firearms went to that department, alcohol and tobacco went to tax and trade. Well, tax and trade has a completely different mission. Their mission is to make money. So, hey, more distilleries, more tax money. Let's do this. So they made it a lot easier to get into the distilling business, but they also have this crazy list of regulations. We'll go into it a little bit, but it would be an entire day by itself talking about the laws around alcohol. So when you want to decide what it is that you're going to distill, this is a great source. It's called the BAM, the Beverage Alcohol Manual. And it gives you all the labeling guidelines. It gives you all the definitions for all the different spirits. As you saw from the table, we distill whiskey and gin, and we also have a vodka. But today I'm going to talk mostly about the whiskey process because that will take us through every possible step that you would experience in a distillery. So we're going to talk mostly about whiskey. The definition of whiskey, it is a spirit distilled from a fermented mash of grain. So you break all that down and you realize you have to have grain. You have to be able to mash it. You have to be able to ferment it, and you have to be able to distill it. And it has to be aged in contact with wood. So there's a lot of gray area there. What kind of wood, what size of barrel, how long, and it's a free-for-all. But as long as it touches wood, then it can be whiskey. If it doesn't touch wood, then it can't be called whiskey, but that gives you White Dog or White Lightning or Moonshine or whatever else you want to call it. So overall, this is the big picture for distillation. Preparation, this is where you get your grain and you get it ready to mash. You're going to dry it, you're going to crush it, and you're going to clean it up a little bit, and you may malt it if it's barley. Once we do that, whoops, hold on, here we go. Now you can use any kind of grain to make whiskey. Any kind. It has to be a cereal grain, which, anything that is a seed that you use for food counts as a grain. So it has to be any kind of cereal grain. So it can be barley, which is also called malt when you've malted it. And we'll talk a little bit about malting. Wheat, rye, quinoa. That's a new one. They're using that. Corn, obviously, people use a lot of corn. I've got a whole slide on grain. We'll talk about that in a minute because I just drew a blank on the rest of them. After you pick your grain, then you will want to crush it and mash it. Mashing is where you're going to soak it in water. And that process is so that you can convert the starches that are stored in those seeds into sugars. That's really all it's doing, is making the sugars available to the yeast during fermentation. So yeast is an organism that will eat all the sugars that you created and produce alcohol as a byproduct, which is a nice way of saying waste. So I won't say it. It produces also carbon dioxide as a byproduct. And then after we get all of that yeast byproduct produced, we want to remove that from the solution. So we've got to separate it out from the yeast and from whatever colors and from whatever else is left in that mash. So we'll take the wash that we produced during fermentation, transfer it into a still, and in distillation, we're removing the alcohol from that overall beer solution that we just created. And the more times you distill it, the more pure that alcohol will be until you can get it to having just pure ethanol. There are various types of alcohol in the alcohol family. Some of those are tastier and some of those are less so. Some of them give you really bad headaches and some of them are okay. So depending on how you distill it tells what kind of products you're going to have at the end and how much of a hangover people will have afterwards. After you finish distilling it to the level you like, then you age it if you're making whiskey. Some spirits don't need to be aged. Think gin, vodka. But for whiskey, it has to be aged. That's a requirement. And then after aging for 2 to 20 years, depending on what you're doing, then you're going to bottle it. So after it matures, you're going to pull it out of the cask. You're going to harvest that. You're going to proof it to bottling proof, and then you're going to bottle it. So that is the distilling process in a nutshell. And that's what I had to learn to do because I know science. So here's an example of some of the grains that I was mentioning earlier. When you want to decide what type of whiskey you're going to make, you want to decide what kind of grain you're going to make it with. You'll get different characteristics from different kinds of grain. Wheat is going to give you a more cereal notes than barley, but barley's also very cereal character. Rye gives you much more spice in your finished product. Rice is something different entirely. If you've ever had the Japanese whiskeys, they lean a little bit more onto rice because they have that sake history. And so they're going to lean a little bit into the rice grain when they make whiskeys. Maize, which is corn, everybody's familiar with that because that's what you have to use when you make bourbon. The definition of bourbon is that it has to be 51% or more corn. And it has to be aged in a new barrel, which is why we have so many used bourbon barrels because they can never reuse it. I think the barrel lobby was powerful at one time. Oats, you can make whiskey out of oats. You can make whiskey out of millet. I forgot about that one. Sorghum, quinoa. It's great. I experimented a little bit, but from the beginning, our story, our philosophy was that we were going to be an Irish style distillery. So my focus has always been on the barley. I've done some with a blend of malted and unmalted barley to create a pot still whiskey. Mostly what I make is 100% malt. So it would be an Irish malt whiskey if I was in Ireland. But since I'm in the United States, they're actually getting a new category now, the American straight single malt or the American single malt, which has been in review by the TTB for the past 2 years. It's like, come on, guys. So,
Hold on. Want to make sure the virtual audience gets to hear this.
oh, I could repeat the question too. So he wants to know what's the difference between 100% malt and single malt. A single malt is a malt whiskey that is distilled in a single distillery. So you're not sourcing a bunch of different malt whiskeys and blending them together from different sources. Everything that's in that is made in the same distillery. That's what they mean by single. It doesn't mean there's just a single grain or a single kind of barley. It's just the distillery is a single distillery. And 100% malt means that the product is made entirely of malted barley. So it can be 100% malt and not be a single. It can be a single and not be 100% malt, but in that case, it would be a single pot still or a single blended or a single something else. You're welcome. So you can see it gets a little complicated, but that's why we have the BAM. And that's why there's 44 different types of whiskeys defined in there. Not counting Scotch, Irish, Canadian, anything from another country, it's a separate category. And you would choose a grain based on the ease of use. So if you are very experienced and you kind of know what's going to happen, then you could choose something that's a little harder to work with, like rye. Rye is really hard to work with. Rye really gums things up. It has a lot of that gluten and it gelatinizes a lot. So it's a lot harder to work with. Barley's pretty easy. Corn, super easy to work with. It doesn't have a lot of digestive enzymes in it, though. So sometimes you have to add extra enzymes to the mash. Your total grain bill is calculated out at 2 pounds of grain for every 1 gallon of wort. Now, wort is that sugar water. So when you're finished mashing and you remove the liquid, that sugar water that you remove is called wort. So if you want to get a 500-gallon fermentation, you're going to need to use 1,000 pounds of grain. Malted versus unmalted. So I've been using this word malt a lot. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the word malted or what that means, but I'm going to go over that a little bit. So when we malt a grain, and typically it's barley that's malted, but you can malt anything. To malt a grain, you're going to allow those seeds to begin to germinate. So this seed is thinking that it's going to grow. And in order to grow, it needs to access the starches that are stored in that seed so that it can feed the plant and allow that plant to start growing while the roots get in and then can pull nutrients from the soil. So we allow that seed to germinate. But before it can actually use any of the starch, we're going to flash heat it. Basically, we're going to toast it so that it stops germinating, but we're not going to heat it so hot that it destroys the enzymes, because that's why we malted it. It activates its enzymes that are in its own seed that will break down the starches into the sugars to feed the plant. But we want to use those enzymes in our mashing because we want the starch, because we want the sugar to give to the yeast, because we want the booze. So yeah, sorry. Uh-huh. Yeah, she's asking about the history of malting. And now that we know about enzymes, it's kind of obvious. But in the early days of whiskey making, how did they even know about that? How did they know that they wanted to malt something or not? And honestly, like the history of most discoveries, it's pretty accidental. They just kind of turned out. Um, and I haven't done a huge research project on the history of distilling and brewing, but they're all very tightly related. Discovering yeast was accidental. In case you're wondering, we all learned in grade school that Louis Pasteur, he discovered all these microbes and all this stuff, and it was great for the medicine, whatever. But it was actually because he wanted better beer. So he was researching beer and what was it that was making the beer work better. And so that's how he isolated yeast and discovered that that's what was making the fermentation happen. But they don't teach you that in school because, alcohol, little kids, they don't do that. But yeah, the history of it, I'm sure it was just all accident. If you had a bag of grain and it started to grow and you're like, oh, dang, I didn't want that. I need to, mash that. And so then maybe they didn't stop the fermentation or the germination, but they went ahead and mashed it right away and they get a better yield. And they're like, wow, this is great. So it could be something like that. So in the malting process, you're activating those enzymes that we need for mashing to convert those starches into sugars. The main digestive enzymes that we're trying to activate here, you probably have heard of before. We like alpha amylase and beta amylase. Those are the main ones. And then glucosidase is another one that we use quite often that we try to activate. He's asking if we can synthesize enzymes, not through malting, but to add them separately. And that, yes, definitely. A lot of people that are trying to use unmalted, like just wheat or just corn, they would need to add an enzyme to it. And so that would be an artificial enzyme that they would add to it, or an enzyme that's produced or isolated some other way. Yeah. Once it gets the sugars, then it doesn't impact the flavor a whole lot. The real impact on the flavor is going to be your type of grain. So in order to get to that starch that is stored in the seed, you need to crack that seed open. So what we want to do is crush that grain. We've got all these malted barley seeds, but we need to get open. We need to get into them. All the levels of protection that seed has are going to keep us from activating anything in there or accessing anything in there. So we need to break those open. We could grind it up and make flour, but then if you've ever tried to add water to flour, you know that surface tension kind of prevents that mixing. It just won't do it. So crushing is the best way. And you want to crush it in such a way that you're not heating it too much, because sometimes you can run it through a mill and it goes so fast that it gets hot. And that's going to deactivate those enzymes that we just tried so hard to activate. So we're going to go more with the crushing. There are a couple of main types of mills that they use. A roller mill is one, and a hammer mill is the other. Now, a hammer mill is usually a lot hotter. So they typically will use a roller mill when they go to crush the grain so that they don't overheat it. You want it small enough that it's broken open and the water can get in, but not so large that it can't access anything, and not so small that it's flour, and that's impossible. Okay, so when we mash, now we have our crushed grain. We're going to put our 1,000 pounds of grain into a mash tun, T-U-N, along with water. We'll talk a little bit more about how much water, but we need water that's hot enough to activate the enzymes, hot enough to gelatinize the starches, but not so hot that it burns it all up. The reason that we're doing this, like I said earlier, is that we're trying to break apart these starches. So this is obviously a representation, loose representation of a starch molecule, but you can see it's very complicated. It's long and it's all branchy and stuff. It's too big for yeast to digest. It can't absorb that. It can't get that into itself, and it doesn't have the enzymes to break it apart. Yeast isn't that sophisticated. So what we want to do is break it down into sugars. So depending on which enzyme is active at that temperature and time, we're going to access several different types of sugar, mostly fructose, glucose. Sometimes we'll get the maltose. And then anything bigger than that needs the glucosinate to break it down further. So that's why we like to have this variety of enzymes so that it can get into all those different nooks and crannies of these complicated molecules and break them down as small as we can so that the yeast has no problem just munching, partying away. So we're trying to, like I said, both gelatinize it and activate the enzyme reactions. So what gelatinization does, and I can't remember if I put this on another slide or not, but anyway, I'll talk about it now because I've got it highlighted up there. Gelatinization is where the water's going to get into those broken apart seeds and kind of get them to swell. So as they swell up, think about a sponge kind of, or something when it gets tapioca. Tapioca is a good example. You soak tapioca and it kind of goes, it gets bigger. That's what's happening to these pieces of barley or whatever grain you're using. As you soak it in this hot water, it's going to swell and it's going to open more nooks and crannies up so that the enzymes can reach more of the starch molecules and get it all broken apart. Gelatinization works better at really high temperatures, but that kills the enzymes. Enzyme temperatures are, in fact, that's what's on my next slide. Boom, there it is. So our two main enzymes are amylase, alpha and beta amylases. And you can see that they're most active at different temperatures. Across the top is the temperature range in Celsius. If you like Fahrenheit, that's on the bottom. So there is a window of ideal temperature where they're both going to be active, maybe not their peak activity range, but if we were at peak activity for beta amylase, alpha amylase would not be happy. If we were at peak for alpha amylase, beta amylase is way low. So we want to find what we call the brewer's window, or that sweet spot in the temperature range where we can activate the enzymes at their maximum potential. And usually when we run ours in there, we're heating it up to right about here, because once it lands in the mash tun, it cools it off. So it sits right about 156 most of the time when we're doing the actual mashing process. Yeah. So she was wondering if the temperature range varies based on the type of grain that you use. And that would be a no for the enzymes. The enzymes have a specific temperature at which they're active. It's a yes for gelatinization. So different types of grains will need different temperatures for gelatinizing. And a lot of times what distillers will do, if they have a grain that's more difficult to gelatinize or needs a higher temperature, they'll do a pre-cook on it and they'll cook that mash and then add enzymes to it after they've cooked it so that it's gelatinized. Any other questions? Yes. Both of these, she wanted to know if there's a reason we want them both activated. And yes, both of these amylases are going to break apart starches at different points. So you can see in this chain, there's some that are hooked chains like that, and there's some that are straight chains. So different enzymes will break these molecules apart at different locations. So if you only had, say, if you only had alpha amylase, all you're going to do is make shorter strands, but you're not going to get rid of any of those bends, any of those hooks. So you're going to need all the different enzymes in order to break them all apart at all the places. Yes, sir.
you go to the peak, 158 for alpha, it's a lower value, but can you then switch between two fermenting stages, one optimal for beta and one optimal for alpha?
You can do that too. Yes, he's wondering if you can modify the temperature as you're mashing to hit these peak optimization points. And you can do that. It's called a step mash, where you step down or step up the temperature as you go. It's safer to step up the temperature because then you don't accidentally overheat everything and kill it all. If you're stepping up, you're starting at the lower temperatures and getting those active, and then you're moving into this higher range where these are active. The difficulty with that is that this is going to do its work on the parts that it's going to do, and then this will work on the parts it's going to do. So if there was a chain that needed to be broken apart in a certain way for this to get to, or vice versa, then they're not going to be able to break down those starch chains that are in different levels of complication. I don't know if that made any sense.
To stop the fermentation? No, that's later.
That's later. Yeah, yeah. There's no alcohol at this point. All right. So in order to do that, we need it to be in water. So water is a very important quality when we're talking about mashing and fermenting and distilling and aging and all of it. In fact, there's an entire book called Water for Brewers. The quality of your water, that's important. Usually you can just get tap water because in the United States, our water is pretty clean. Usually the water that you get from a municipal source has been modified somewhat so that it is a higher pH, lower pH or in the acid range, it corrodes pipes. So they want to raise the pH just above neutral so that it protects all of the pipes and the plumbing. So when you use it, if you're going to use it in mashing, you're going to want to adjust that pH slightly so that it's down in the acidic range where all of these enzymes are going to work better. Somewhere around 4 to 5 pH. Did I see a hand? He's asking about chlorine in municipal water. By the time you're done heating it to the right temperature, that chlorine will dissipate. So it's not usually a concern. The nice thing about municipal water is that you're not going to have contamination of heavy metals, specifically things like iron. If you have any iron in your water, that's death to all chemical processes. So if your water has iron in it, you have to get different water, somehow treat it. It's hard to remove. Reverse osmosis is good, or you can distill your water, which fortunately we don't have to do. That's expensive. But yeah, you'll have to treat it to get rid of those heavy metals. Some minerals, you like magnesium, you like calcium, those are great for the yeast. It feeds it, it makes it happy, they can reproduce. But you don't want a lot of the heavier metals in there. Most municipalities do offer a water report, and you can read your water report and get an idea of what is in the water. And right then and there, you don't even have to send your water off to a lab. So you know what you're gonna have to do to it. The amount of water that you need is determined by how much finished product you want. If you want, so say we're trying to get 500 gallons of wort, I'm going to keep on that because that's what I do. So it's easy in my head. If I want 500 gallons of wort to ferment, then I'm going to need 600 gallons of water. You need to compensate for the amount of water that the grain is going to absorb. And grain will usually absorb 0.15 gallons per pound. So if we have 1,000 pounds of grain, then we're going to lose, I said 650, then we're going to lose 150 gallons of water just absorbed into the grain. And then when we get rid of the grain, then that water goes with it. And so we can't pull that out of the mash. Okay. Questions on that? I think we already did. Yes, sir. So he's wondering what we do with our spent grain. What we do with it, we rake it out. It's much nicer mash tun than when I was experimenting, but we have a rake in the mash tun that shoves it out the front door and we scrape it out into hoppers. And then we have a farmer that comes and picks it up and gives it to his cows. So it has some good nutrients in it and obviously the fiber and that kind of thing. The cows like it. Hopefully not very much sugar. Hopefully we got all the sugar out. All right, so once we have all of our sugar in the water and we've made our wort, we now are going to transfer that wort into a fermentation tank. Fermentation, this is basically one of the key processes. This is where the yeast is going to eat all that sugar we just spent so much time making or releasing from the grain. Yeast is not an ingredient. Yeast is an organism. So if you keep in mind that this is a living organism and we are managing its environment, when you're fermenting, then you're going to have a much healthier fermentation and you're going to have much better results at the end. So think about, what does this yeast need to be active and healthy and reproduce and stay alive for a long time? It needs enough food. It needs the right temperature. It needs a healthy environment. A lot of yeast, unfortunately, die in a high alcohol environment. So once it creates all of its waste product, I mean, its byproduct, it can't live in there anymore and it dies. So different varieties of yeast actually have higher alcohol tolerance levels. They've been selected for to do that, but many of them can't. And so you just have to manage all of that. Yeast will also generate heat as it metabolizes. So it's going to eat that sugar, metabolize that sugar, and do all the living processes that living organisms do and release heat as it does that. But if it gets too hot, then it also dies. So we have to manage the temperature of the fermentation as well. The fermentation tanks that we have at the distillery are jacketed. So basically they have a layer around the outside that we circulate glycol through to manage the temperature so we can keep it cool. Yes. Okay. So once we have that environment controlled and we know what we're going to need to control for, how do we know if it's active? How do we know it's doing a good job? And how do we know when it's done? Because if it's done and you let it sit there for several days, all this dead yeast in there is going to make it taste bad. Just saying. So you want to know, when is it done? When are we going to pull this? So we watch for CO2 production. So how much bubbling is it doing? We watch for Brix, which is a sugar reading, or specific gravity, which measures the density of the solution. And as that sugar water converts into alcohol, the density will change, and we can take measurements of that. We also watch the temperature. If it's not producing a lot of heat anymore, then we know there's not a lot of live yeast in there that are being active. So those three things we can watch to see when the fermentation is complete. And at that point, we can stop the fermentation. Usually we drop the temperature. We call it crashing the ferment. So we drop the temperature to about refrigeration temperature, between 40 and 45. And then that puts all that's left of the yeast into hibernation. Some yeast is what we call a bottom flocculator. Yeah, I know that sounds fun, doesn't it? That just means it clumps together. So if it flocculates to the bottom, then we can isolate the wash, the quote unquote beer off the top. If it flocculates to the top, then we can isolate the beer out the bottom. So depending on what variety of yeast you have will determine then how you take your wash, which is distiller's beer, we call it. It's basically beer. It's just not hopped or anything like that. Then we pull that out depending on where that yeast drops or floats when it goes into hibernation. Let's see. Usually somebody asks me what kind of yeast we use, but yes, sir.
you have to manage the concentration of sugar in your solution before you put the yeast in, so that you manage the life of the yeast after it's done converting the sugar to alcohol, so that you don't lose any sugar in your solution, or wort, I think you call it.
He's wondering how we manage the quantity of sugars that are in the wort so that we balance the amount of sugar we started with the amount of sugar that the yeast can process before it dies. So we do, when we take a measure during our setup and experimentation phase, we would measure how much sugar we get in the initial wort and the quantity of that. And then we can calculate how many yeast cells we would need to add based on that amount of sugar. So about 1.7 million cells per liter, I believe, is the pitch rate for most yeast varieties. Yes. Yes, yes. She's asking about the yeast variety that flocculates. Now, one thing I will say real quick, there is one species of yeast that's used for all fermentation, brewing, distillation. Everything uses Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That is the species of yeast. But just like there's a species of dog and there are thousands of breeds, same thing with yeast. There's a species of yeast, but there are thousands of varieties, depending on what characteristics you want in your final product. So what we use is usually used for Scotch ale. It's called a Scotch ale yeast, and it's going to create flavor compounds that will give it more of that taste that you would expect in a Scotch or a Scotch ale. And since we're focusing on the barley and the single malt and all of that, that really goes really well with our grain bill and what we're trying to make. Yes, sir, in the back. So he's asking if I ever tried any other kinds of yeast. And we did a little bit, but yes, mostly to your point, we knew what we wanted. And so that's why I lean towards that yeast pretty much from the beginning. Now you can use a bread yeast and create a fermented product, but you're going to have way different flavor profiles. Yes, sir. So he's asking if we want liquid or powdered yeast. And I will say that for the first 10 years that we've been doing this, we have been using a liquid yeast. And in this past year, we've had, for various reasons, some extra time on our hands. So we're experimenting with the dehydrated yeast to see what difference it makes, because it's a lot cheaper. It is a lot cheaper to use a dehydrated yeast. So we are experimenting to see if there is a variety of dehydrated yeast that will give us the same result. Yes, sir. He's wondering if I reuse my yeast. I don't wash it, but we do harvest it one time. My fermentation tanks are all open. And so the likelihood of having contaminants in the yeast is pretty high. So if I tried to use it again and again, I would end up with mostly wild yeast and bacteria after 2 or 3 tries. So I only harvest it once and repitch it one time. Yes. She's asking if we can cultivate our own yeast. And the answer is yes, you can. But no, we don't. So we do buy our yeast all the time. My lab is very tiny. If you haven't been, you should come. But if you've ever been, you may have seen my closet that is the lab. And there's just not, we don't have the facilities for that. But yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Ask about acellular processes I know that they're using yeast now to make milk and other protein drinks. And I know those are genetically modified yeast, but is there any like rumors in the yeast community about keeping strains pure and, you know?
Well, she's wanting to know about, I don't even know how to rephrase this to re-ask the question, but purity in yeast communities, because different industries are starting to use yeast to create other products. And I'm not really into the yeast community. I know about it, I can source it, but I don't get the newsletter. So, I mean, you laugh, but there actually is a newsletter. But yeah, I don't know. I would expect there would be some, but most people that are real hyper yeast purity people are going to cultivate their own. And you can work with labs that will have a strain just for you, and they will keep that just for you and cultivate it for you when you need it. So, you know, you can narrow in if you have a specific thing that you want. You can do that too. Okay, so this is a chart that can kind of tell you about the activity level of your fermentation. So you can see that there's a couple of different kinds of sugar. We start out with a lot of glucose and fructose and almost none, ethanol and CO2. Ethanol and CO2 are the products that are produced when we metabolize the sugar gets used up. And I don't think there's a light on this. I want to point to it, but our fermentation is usually done in 4 days. So you can see that that is kind of the end of the fast part of the process. And then everything else just takes a long time to get any higher than that. Our yeast doesn't survive to that level of alcohol. And if we left it, like I said, we have open fermentation. If we left it for 10 or 15 or 17 days, it would get gross. Just to put it bluntly, it wouldn't be very good anymore. We'd have a lot of contaminants in it. Okay, so we just made a distiller's version of beer called wash. Now, what are we going to do with it? Well, now we have to distill it. So we finished all the chemistry part. Now we have to start the physics part. We want to isolate that alcohol out of that solution that we just created. So distillation is a basic physical separation of materials. So you just gradually heat. Every type of substance has a different boiling point. And when you hit that boiling point of the substance that you want, that substance comes out and you collect it as a distillate. Distillation is not isolated to alcohol. Distillation is used in all kinds of industries. Anytime you want to separate liquids, you want to distill them. That's the best way. Alcohol's boiling point is around 160 degrees. So we're going to heat our solution to 160, and that's when the most volatile alcohol molecules will start to vaporize out of the solution. Like I mentioned earlier, there's several different molecules of alcohol, depending on how many carbons are in the chain. So the most volatile of the alcohol molecules are going to be like 1 or 2 carbons, and they're going to come off really fast. And at every stage of distillation, they're going to come off first, which is actually good because those are poisonous. So we want to get rid of those. Have you ever heard of methanol? Yeah. So that comes through at the beginning. We call that the 4 shots, and then we get rid of that. You're welcome. And you use a different type of still depending on what kind of product you want to produce.
Ethanol at around 158. Is it possible to hold your mash or beer at this point at that temperature until all of that evaporation stops and then proceed, or do you just get all of the 4 shots as the temperature climbs?
So he's asking if we can control the temperature enough to just get rid of the methanol first and then go into the stuff that we want. Theoretically, yes. In the real world, no. You can't hold the temperature that consistently. Most of the heating, you're either using steam, you're using direct fire, you're using, some people use electricity, which I wouldn't recommend. But yeah, it's going to continue heating and because of the water in there. So it will continue warming until it gets to the boiling point of water. You can't really hold it at that lower temperature in the real world. But that would be fun. You could just click a button and say, okay, let's get the next one. Okay, let's get the next one. But that's why we distill in phases. You're either going to use a column still and you're going to get your phases that way with the plates, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So maybe I won't start on that right now. In fact, boom, there it is. Look at that. Yes.
Right, when we've been distilling for 500, 600 years, like.
Thousands, maybe,
Yeah.
depending on who you listen to.
Come up with a better way to do it. Like,
Maybe there is no better way.
technology, there's not, again, I'll report out the, I don't know. Moving to a way to make it better, because it just feels, it's so mechanical and it's so, I don't know.
He's wondering if there isn't a better way to distill, something a little more technologically advanced. You know, there are people that experiment with different techniques for distilling, for aging, for all those things. And a lot of times they're poo-pooed because it's not legit. And honestly, they have not been able to come up with any way that I've heard of that makes a good product. And this really is very streamlined when you're looking at this kind of a still, and I'll talk about this briefly, but it's a process like any manufacturing process you would ever see. It can churn it out. But it would be like if you were trying to improve the technology for milk. I mean, there's only so much you can do to a cow. It's just a process, and that's where you get it from. So I'm thinking that you could try things. Sometimes they do freeze distillation where they freeze the solution and then the alcohol has a higher, you know, it doesn't freeze as quickly. And so then you can isolate it that way and different things. I've never tried that. I imagine it would work, but I think you just get a slushy, a beer slushy. I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Right. You wouldn't be separating out your methanols. Okay, so these are the three main types of stills that most distillers, that you would see at most distilleries. You're either going to see a pot still. This is mine, by the way. This is Darby. Darby-O still. That's Darby. This is a column still, and you can see where it gets the name. It's also called a continuous still. And then this is a hybrid because it has both a pot and a column. So in a pot still, you're going to do a single solution and a single heat. It heats everything at once and runs it up through that head and through the condenser into a collecting tank, which is there. So this process is going to get us a distillate that has more flavor compounds. It's not as pure as what you would get off of a column still. I need both hands for this part because I gesture. So as that alcohol is heating and those molecules are starting to come off, well, they're not going to come off in isolation because they're biological molecules. And so they're three-dimensional. And sometimes it's going to get hooked onto something. Maybe a water molecule, maybe some other compound, some flavor element, some, you know, whatever, propanol, who knows? And it's going to carry that with it. Well, that's not pure alcohol. Maybe we care, maybe we don't. It depends on what it's carrying. But in a pot still, sometimes those alcohol molecules and their companions will bump into the sides and kind of condense and drip back down and then revaporize. And every time that happens, more of those passengers get dropped off. And so you're going to slightly purify your alcohol. Pot still doesn't have a lot of reflux opportunity. That's what that process is called, is reflux. In a column still, this whole tall chimney actually has plates all along it. So every one of those circles, those windows up the front, there's a plate there. And you can open or close those plates depending on how pure you want your alcohol to be. And so as the alcohol vaporizes up the column, it hits those plates, condenses there, and drips back down and revaporizes. And it moves through those plates. And every time it hits a plate, it becomes more and more pure. So if you want a pure, clean vodka product, you're going to want an industrial column still, because that's going to clean it up, it's going to taste clean, and it's going to feel smooth, and it's going to be really great. But if you want a whiskey that has some mouthfeel and characteristic to it, you're going to want a pot still, because it's not just going to be straight alcohol. It's going to have some of those mouthfeel notes and some of those fruity notes and some of those other characteristics that you look for in a whiskey. So those are the two basic types of stills, depending on what kind of product you want to produce. A hybrid still is just like it says, it's a hybrid. It's a combination of the two. So you can use something like that if you have limited availability, limited space. You can use something like that to kind of get one way or the other. If you open all your plates, it kind of acts like a pot still. If you close all your plates, it kind of acts like a column still. Yes, sir. That's 6 plates. Yeah, so if something's 6 times distilled, they have 6 plates closed. Yes, sir.
Basically do a stripping run for your entire batch and then put that product through a pot still and still get those flavor compounds?
Yes, you answered your own question. He's wondering if you can do a stripping run on a column still and then use a pot still. Any flavor that you've removed is gone. Any flavor you didn't put in there in the beginning is not there. So yeah, once you remove it, you can't add it back. And speaking of stripping runs, so typically we're going to have with a pot still, 2 pot stills or a pot still that we can use twice. I have 2 pot stills. I have the big 500-gallon one, and then I have a smaller 140-gallon one. The first one that we use, and we do what this gentleman said, we do a stripping run. It's called a stripping run or beer stripping, because we are stripping all the alcohol out of the beer. And we're just collecting as much of the alcohol as we can. And it's called low wines. So that alcohol comes across along with all of its, tag-alongs and all of those congeners. Congeners is what we say when we talk about those flavor molecules that carry along and make impurities. So we gather all of that, and it's called low wine. I don't know why it's called low wine. It's not wine. It has nothing to do with wine, but hey, whatever. So we collect all of that from the stripping run, low wines. It's usually about 50 proof. We usually get about 140 gallons out of 500 gallons at 24 proof. Yeah, it's condensed. Then we take those low wines, put them into the smaller still, and we do what's called a spirit run or a finishing run. And this is when we're going to cut out all the stuff we don't want. So this time we don't collect everything. This time when the methanol comes through first, we don't keep it. It goes into a bucket. And then the heads are going to come through. Heads is the next cut. And these are going to be okay tasting, okay smelling. It's higher proof. If you want to make a bottom shelf spirit, then you're going to keep more of those because, then you can just add a lot more water to it. Water's cheaper. But when it gets to the level in the distillation where the molecules that are coming out taste and smell and feel the way you want, then that's where we make a cut. And then we keep the hearts. So everything past that point that we like, we keep. At some point, it's going to get to where all the good stuff is gone. And now you're getting into the heavier alcohols, and they are usually bitter tasting and not that great. And those are called the tails, and that's where we cut it off. Yes, sir.
You're also talking ketones and esters that give it the flavor.
Yes, sir. Yeah, he's saying, do we get the ketones and the esters and those kinds of things? And those are the molecules that tag along and give it the flavor and the mouthfeel that we're talking about. And you can smell those during the distillation process. You're going to get a banana smell, or you're going to get like apples or some, usually it's a fruity note. I don't know why. If it doesn't smell fruity, if it smells like dirty feet, then it's bad. Don't keep that one. And then the column still, it's also called a continuous still. It usually has one, but sometimes it has two columns, so that if it's a continuous still, it's going to be continuously cycling the wash into it and distilling it out and then shooting it out another direction. I've not used one, so I'm not 100% familiar with all the ways that this would work, but they're pretty huge. They're multiple story buildings. They're very large. Then the hybrid still we talked about a little bit already. So you can manage your space considerations a little bit better and have some flexibility there. Oh, real quick, copper. The reason that most stills, well, all stills have to have some kind of copper in them somewhere is that one of those byproducts that gets produced is sulfur. And sulfur in any amount is going to taste terrible in your finished product. So the copper will react with that sulfur and remove it from the solution. Sometimes you then have to do an acid wash inside your still to then clear it off so that it has fresh copper to react with it. But you don't need this much copper. This is just cool looking, and it, distributes heat really well too. But if you at least have a copper head on your still, then that's enough copper. Sir, back. Oh, he wants to know a little bit about what that bulbous part does. That's on the head, and it's called an onion. And that was also on the pot still. But what that does is it gives it a small amount of reflux. So there's going to be some circulation happening in there where it opens up, and that vapor is going to do a little bit of turbulence in there, and that's going to create that reflux that we talked about. I don't know what, am I out of time? Am I good? Okay. Do I talk faster? Are we okay? So when you're distilling, how do you know when you are getting the stuff that you want? I mean, you sit there and stick your finger in it the whole time? No. And that would be really hard to communicate to other people that are coming behind you. Like if you have an apprentice distiller or something, how do you tell them, oh, it tastes like this? No. So every point along that distillation, you're going to have different temperature and a different proof of the spirit as it's coming off the still. So we can look for those checkpoints to see where we are in the process. Once we track those in the initial runs and we identify those points that we want, then we can communicate those to anyone else that's coming behind and trying to recreate and make the product. We also, so like I said, temperature and also proof. Proof is just a measure of the amount of alcohol that's in the solution. The amount of alcohol by percent, alcohol by volume, the percent of alcohol will go up to 100%. Obviously, if you have 100% alcohol, then it's 100% ABV. But proof is half of that. Proof is something that they invented when they didn't have tools. And when you would catch it on fire or mix it with gunpowder or something like that. And when the flash point, when it hit that flash point, that was proofed. That was where they liked it. And somehow it ended up that was 50% alcohol or 100 proof. I'm too used to equipment and tools. I don't know if I could figure that out. But anyway, that's kind of where that came from. It was proofed with gunpowder and fire. Go figure.
So it showed that it actually had strength to it, they mixed with gunpowder.
And maybe, yeah, maybe they borrowed that. Maybe the moonshiners borrowed that technique then, and that's how they proofed their, yeah. Okay, so once it's distilled, then we need to age it. So remember, we're talking about whiskey. Whiskey has to be aged. And to age it, we have to have it put in contact with wood. That's the law. So we're going to put it into a barrel, a wooden barrel. Barrels are actually magic. They are, it's like the phone booth in Harry Potter where you go in and you end up somewhere else. So you put whiskey, you put this stuff in a barrel, and when it comes out, it's something completely different. It's amazing. I actually put one run. So I had one run. It was all the same new make. I had 3 barrels, bought them all at the same time. They were little, when I started, I used 10-gallon barrels. They were all from the same cooperage, same age, same everything. Filled them all. When I opened them up, they were all different. How does that happen? It's magic. Actually, there have been some studies, and I didn't bring an article with me, but it's pretty interesting. People are doing some pretty intense studies on the chemistry of barrels right now. But a barrel adds all the color. So any color that your whiskey has came from the barrel. And depending on the type of barrel that you have, it will give you up to 60 to 70% of your flavor as well. The other reason you have to use a barrel is because that's the law. We want to cut it to proof. So when we finish our spirit run, typically my spirits end up at about 135 proof. And if I put it into a barrel at 135, it would extract more oak character than I would like. So I'm going to cut that down to a more gentler proof to put it into a barrel. I'm going to barrel in a new barrel at about 120 proof. If it's a used barrel, I'll nudge it a little bit higher and I'll barrel it at 125. But how do I get it to proof? How do I know how much water to add to proof it down? So we have to calculate. Don't we love math? Yes, I do. It's great. Quantity of water. So you take how much spirits you have, what your current ABV is of those spirits. Then you're going to divide that by what ABV you want. After you get that number, then you're going to subtract out how much spirits you started with, and whatever's left, that's how much you got to fill up with water. It's pretty cool, huh? So we're going to proof it down to put it into a barrel. Now you can see here that there are different amounts of charring or burnt on these barrel staves here. So this one is called, what we call an alligator char. And you can kind of see why they call it alligator char. Kind of looks like an alligator skin or whatever. So that's a pretty heavy char, not too heavy. If you went deeper into the wood, then it would be a heavy char. You can go up to a 10 level. This is about, depending on what scale you use, this would be about a 3 or 4. And then here's a little bit less burnt, and then less, and then we're getting up to where it's just toasted. The reason that we want to char these barrels, several reasons. We want the color. So that's one big reason, because you won't get a lot of color if you don't have a lot of this dark wood exposed. We want to open up the pores of the wood so that the spirit can soak into the wood and extract some of the characteristics of that wood. We also want to caramelize some of the sugars from the wood. So if we're using oak or pecan or cherry, they use some wild wood for barrels sometimes, but you want to access those sugars and add that to the flavor component of your finished product. So that's another reason that we're going to char the barrels. Yes, sir.
Have you considered using an ultrasound tank? Types of wood to accelerate the extraction process and experiment with different woods on your finished product to see how it would change the flavor in less time?
So he's asking about the ultrasound technology that will vibrate the spirit in the barrel and see if it'll age faster. And the answer to that is no, I've not. I've read a couple things about it. And I mean, some people say, hey, this is great. And some people say, this is terrible. So it's whatever you, I mean, if you want to experiment with things like that, I don't consider myself cutting edge. Have you found that? So one thing I will say, one of the classes that I went to multiple years ago at a small distillery in Denver, they were experimenting with different things. And what they were experimenting with was aquarium bubblers. They had aquarium pumps that was pumping air into each barrel. And they basically just dropped an aquarium bubbler into each barrel and thought that that might help it age faster. I don't know if it helped it age faster, but it sure looked weird because you had these hoses everywhere. It was bizarre. But I don't know if it worked for them or not. They were at the beginning phases of that experiment. Different varieties and sizes of barrels. I already mentioned there's different kinds of woods that are used. You can use smaller barrels for a faster aging. Like I mentioned earlier, I used 10-gallon barrels when I first started. I can get a spirit that's aged to a similar level of aging as a 53-gallon barrel in 2 years, but in a 10-gallon, I can get that in 6 months. But all I get is the aging. So there's a difference between aging and maturing. So aging basically is how much wood character, how much contact has it had with wood, how much oak notes, how much color, all that stuff comes from the wood. That's your aging. Maturing is your advanced chemical reactions that are taking place because there's some oxidation reactions that are happening inside that barrel over time. There's some evaporation that happens. There's the moving in and out of the wood as the temperature changes and the wood expands. So all of those things actually take time. Or you could maybe artificially create those conditions maybe and speed it up. I'm not sure. But that gives a completely different character to the wood, to the whiskey. So you do need to consider what your barrel is like, your size and your type of wood and your level of charring. But you also need to keep in mind that time makes a difference too, because you are producing new molecules. There is some chemical change happening inside the barrel. Now the small barrel, I will say that for me, 6 months was enough. Because if I left it in a 10-gallon barrel longer than 6 months, it way over extracted the oak. And I always say in my tours, it's like chewing pencils. It's just not good. Some people like that heavy oak note, and so they would probably leave it in a little bit longer. But, you know, I'm the boss. I can do it how I want. So I pulled it out a little bit sooner than that. 6 months was great. In a 15-gallon barrel, it was 9 months. I found out that it's actually very linear. The amount of aging to the size of the barrel. So 2 years, 53 gallons, 15 gallons, like 9 months, 10 gallons, 6 months. Yes, sir.
But surface area is squared. That's why a smaller barrel will have less time. It's because you've got less of a ratio between the two. But what they do in Napa Valley is they put slots into the bigger barrels to increase the linear surface area of the wood. And you could try doing that with your bigger barrels to accelerate the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's saying that sometimes in barrels, they will cut notches in them to increase the surface area. And that would, oh, like staves dropped in. And then that would decrease the amount of time for aging. And right. And then that would change the amount of aging based on your surface area, but it's not going to change your amount of maturity. So, you know, it's kind of a catch-22 on that. It just depends on what you like and what you're trying to accomplish. Yes, ma'am.
Different amounts of air in the barrels, or they'll pull, will leaving more air result in more maturation?
She's wondering if the amount of headspace or the amount of air that we leave in a barrel will impact the level of maturation. Typically it doesn't, because A barrel is porous anyway. And so there's going to be the movement of the air in and out, regardless of how much air you give it to start with. It's still going to exchange at roughly the same rate. It's mostly going to depend on the temperature expansion of the wood and compression. Yes, sir. He wants to know, but when you look at an age statement of a whiskey, how do you know what size of barrel did they use? You don't. You have no idea. Typically, if it's aged 12 years or 15 years, it was a big barrel. I can't even imagine there'd be anything left in a 10-gallon barrel after 12 years. Evaporative loss is anywhere from 2 to 8% per year, depending on your environmental conditions. So yeah, you probably there wouldn't even be anything left to drink after 12 years in a small barrel. Yeah. It's called the angel share, evaporative loss. The devil's cut, have you ever heard of devil's cut? The devil's cut is the amount that gets soaked into the wood. So was it Jim Beam that had the devil's cut whiskey? Yeah. What a hoke. I mean, they can't squeeze the wood and get the devil's cut out. I mean, come on. Whatever. It's cute. Yeah. My barrels, I actually source them from a cooper in Minnesota. Interestingly enough, it's Missouri oak, but it's cured and coopered in Minnesota. They have some great barrel coopers in Missouri. The Independent Stave Company is a big one, but they're so busy providing barrels to all of the big bourbon distilleries that they don't even want to talk to little guys like us. So, I said, yeah, I need 5 barrels. You mean 5 truckloads? No, just 5. And they were like, no. So I found a really great cooperage up in Minnesota, and they sent me a sample barrel, and I just opened it and smelled it. I'm like, oh, this is the one. That wood just smelled. It was so great. It was. So anyway, I get my barrels from Minnesota, and they'll season the wood there and let it dry out, and then build it and char it and do all the things. This right here is a rick house where they store barrels. In Kentucky, they store them like that a lot. And sometimes in a rick house like that, they're going to circulate the barrels as well, because you're going to have different levels of humidity at different levels of the building, and you're going to have different amounts of heat. And so they want to try to make all of the maturing and the aging in the barrels consistent. And so they might have some kind of an elevator system so that they can rotate the barrels. Another way to get around that is when you harvest them, you choose barrels from different places in the rick house when you harvest. So maybe I'll take 10 from the bottom, and then 20 from the middle on the east side, and 20 from the middle on the west side, and then get 16 off the top or whatever. And then when I put all those in my tank, then it kind of compensates for that different types of aging that happens. Just depends on what your warehouseman likes to do. Angel share, he mentioned the amount of humidity affects the amount of angel share. The evaporative loss will change depending on how much moisture is in the air. If you have more water in the air, you're going to lose more alcohol as a percentage to water in your barrel. But your barrel's going to stay kind of moist, so it's not going to release as much. It's very complicated math. I don't have it figured out, but I just know it happens. If you have less water in your air, so your humidity is lower, then you're going to lose more water out of the barrel in proportion to the amount of alcohol that you lose. So you're still getting a loss out of the barrel, but the proof of the whiskey that's still in the barrel is going to be different. So maybe I barreled at 120 and I harvest it as 140 proof, because more water has evaporated out than alcohol. I've still lost, 8% or whatever of my total, but I've retained more of the alcohol than the water. And so I can make up a lot of that when I proof it for bottling strength. So it's kind of cool. So sometimes barrels are stored up and down, and sometimes they're stored on their sides. No reason whatsoever, except for tradition and mobility. In our place, we have to move the barrels around a lot because they're all just stacked in a room. And so if I want the oldest whiskey, I have to get the barrels from the back of the room. So I'm going to have to get my forklift and pull out all the pallets of barrels in front of it to get to the ones in the back. So I want mine on a pallet standing straight up so that I can stack them, move them, do all the things with it easier. In a rick house like this, they are actually built to roll the barrels. And so they can roll them. They've got like conveyor systems and all that sort of thing. And so they're going to probably store them on their sides. But there's really not a lot of difference in the aging that happens based on orientation. So this is kind of a close-up. What happens in that barrel? So there's a lot of different things that are going on. We talked about the humidity and the evaporation. So water and alcohol can evaporate out. It can also be absorbed in. It's not going to happen as readily because, there's much higher concentration inside the barrel than out. So mostly you're just getting evaporation loss. There's going to be a little bit of convection happening inside there because as there's loss in certain places, that spirit's going to move to fill wherever it was lost. So there's going to be some slight motion in there. And there's always Brownian motion anyway. So there's going to be movement of the molecules. And as those molecules are moving around, then they're going to get an opportunity to interact and experience some of that chemical change that we were talking about for maturing. You're going to get your color. You're going to get all of those flavors from the wood as it moves in and out, expanding and contracting in different temperatures. Okay, he was talking about age statement on a whiskey a second ago. When you look at a bottle and you see that it's a 12-year aged whiskey, you could have 18-year age in that bottle. But anything that's younger than that, that's the identifying age. So a 12-year whiskey has 12-year in it, but it might also have 15 and 18 and whatever. If we have a 6-year straight malt, not straight, my bad, single malt. We have a 6-year single malt, and most of the whiskey that it's in that blend is actually 8 years. But because I did include some of the 6-year aged in that blend, then it's called a 6-year. So that's how the age statement is working on bottles. Typically, well, not typically. Lately, they are starting to get away from age statement whiskeys. They're called NAS, no age statement. And I'm not really sure why they would do that, except that, I don't know, people don't care as much, or maybe they didn't have as much of the old stuff and they're like, well, darn, we ran out. So now what are we going to do? Well, this is just as good. It's just not 18 years old. Okay. Just don't put the statement on there. A finishing cask. Some of you may have heard that there's a whiskey finished with a sherry finish or with a Malbec finish or whatever, a port finish. I like port finish personally, but that's when a whiskey has been removed from its original barrel, transferred into a barrel that was used for something else. So if you had sherry and you used up the sherry and you had the barrel, and then you put the whiskey in there for, usually 6 to 9 months is a good finishing time. And then that would have a sherry finish. You can leave it in longer. I have a port finish that I left in for a year, and it's pretty good. So usually when it's a used barrel, you're not going to get a lot of oak extraction or wood character from it. You're just going to get some of the flavor of what's in there before. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so review. This is all the stuff we talked about. We talked about preparing our grain and crushing it so that it didn't overheat. We talked about soaking it in water and getting all the starches converted into sugars. We talked about fermenting so that the yeast could eat those sugars and produce alcohol as a byproduct. We talked about then separating out the alcohol from the solution through distillation, aging in barrels to add new flavors, and it's the law. And then when we bottle, we take it out of the barrels, filter it, proof it to wherever we want. Well, not wherever we want. There's laws about that too. And then it's ready. ready for consumption at that point. All right. I had a Q&A slide, but I think I put it in the wrong place. Are there any more questions? In the back.
All right, I'm going to come around with the microphone, so raise your hand so the live stream can hear you. And we're well past 11:30, so we'll probably just take a couple more questions.
So the one thing that you did not get to is right up there on the screen right now. Can you talk a bit about gin?
I can talk a little bit about gin. If you don't mind, we're past time, but so Builder's gin, gin by definition is a neutral spirit that has been produced with characteristics of juniper. So you have to have a neutral spirit, which is like that pure alcohol we talked about. And then you can either distill it or redistill it or soak it in some combination of botanicals, as long as you have juniper as its defining character. So it has to have notes of juniper. Otherwise, it doesn't count as gin. Now, that is like the only guideline. It has to have characteristics of juniper. That's like the fence around the playground. And the whole rest of the field you can play in. So for the Builder's Botanical Gin, I actually used 11 botanicals. This one I created one summer between school years. I brought stuff home from school and distilled in the kitchen. But I, was totally new to this whole world. And I knew I didn't like gin. But we knew we needed a gin in the portfolio. We had to have clear spirits to pay the bills while the whiskey was aging. So I had to come up with some kind of a gin that was good. I thought, oh, that's impossible. But I know. I found out it is possible. So I basically just got all different kinds of botanicals. I read about, Bombay Sapphire. I read about there's a distillery down southeast of Missouri, Pinckney Bend, and they actually made a decent gin. I was like, oh, maybe it's possible. I mean, I didn't like it, but it wasn't terrible. So then maybe it's possible to make a decent gin. So I started playing around with different botanicals, did a lot of research. I created what's called, or borrowed, I didn't create this, a flavor web, and plotted out what flavors I would like. I actually gave it a name and a backstory so that it had a personality. When I started, it wasn't this, it was something completely different. It was actually the Irish goddess of light. Doesn't that sound like a great gin? Yeah, her name was Anya. So anyway, the characteristics that I wanted to have in the gin, I wanted some citrus notes. I wanted some floral notes. I wanted very little juniper, but you had to have some. I didn't want heat. I didn't want an alcohol burn to it. I like all my stuff to be very smooth. So anyway, taking that and all the research, and I plotted that out and came up with the proportions that I needed for primary flavors, secondary flavors, tertiary, and came up with the proportions that I would need, and then put it all into a little flask with some vodka, because I didn't have neutral spirit at the time. Neutral spirit's 190 proof. It's hard to get a hold of. And then distilled it out, and it was good. So it worked.
All right, Benay, we've got one more question, so we'll end with this one here.
Hey, I was just wondering, a lot of wines continue to age in the bottle. Does anything happen with spirits as they continue to sit in the bottle? Do they change over time at all?
No. Wines have some, when they pull it out of the barrels, they're like fermenting in the barrel. So then they bottle it straight out of there. So it's still going to have some of its yeasts and some of its materials that are in there that cause the aging. We don't have anything like that in the whiskey because it's been boiled out and barreled and aged and all those things. So there isn't anything left in there to age. I will say, though, that if you leave a bottle in the sunshine for an extended period of time, the ultraviolet radiation will bleach it. Takes all the color out. I was amazed. Somebody brought me a bottle and said, this is clear. How did that happen? Sat it in the sun. Still tasted just like Sons of Erin, but it was clear. I was mind blown, quite frankly. But anyway, if you're interested in some more samples, we brought more than just the Builders, but we have Builders and some whiskeys back there, and that's it.
All right, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Benay. Thank you for joining us today. And yeah, please check out the samples. Enjoy the rest of your day.